There's a lot that happens in SharePoint that is not going on necessarily in the web application that serves up site collections and subsites. And this work is mostly done either through the timer service independently or as part of a service application. And service applications simply provide shared services for SharePoint sites. You can create and manage the various service applications via central administration, but also through PowerShell. And there are a lot of service applications that are available by default. What most people do when they're setting up a development environment is run the configuration wizard, which creates all the service applications for you. There's nothing really wrong with doing that on a development machine. You should not do it on production. But considering the heavy footprint of SharePoint 2013, you may want to consider not running the configuration wizard and just provisioning the service applications that you actually require. All right, so let's jump over to our SharePoint server and look at Central Admin and examine the service applications and how they are created. All right, so here we are in SharePoint Central Administration, and on the home page of Central Admin, under the Application Management heading, there is a link to Manage Service Applications. And this page shows us all of the service applications that are installed and running on the farm. So I have access services and app management and business data services and Excel services and all kinds of stuff, because this is a demo machine and I do a lot of demonstrations of different pieces of it. But like I said, given the heavy memory requirements of SharePoint, I recommend that you do not create all of these and just create them one-off as needed, especially considering the fact that the configuration wizard may create them for you, but they certainly won't be fully configured. And most of them, at least most of the interesting ones, require some additional configuration beyond just being created. But to create a new one, you can come over here to the New button. And this is the list of all of the out-of-the-box service applications that are available to you in SharePoint 2013. As a developer, you have the option to create additional service applications if you so desire. And a service application is only really good in scenarios where you need shared processing for something that may be memory intensive that you want to split over multiple machines. If you have a service application that is used by one web front end in a synchronous mode for web pages, then you're just showing off when you create a service application. There's no reason why you should do that. You can also connect to service applications in other farms via their proxies. So it is possible to set up in big environments SharePoint farms that provide heavy lifting for big shared services scenario. Perhaps you need a number of servers to do your search indexing, and the search querying is spread over multiple SharePoint farms. The Connect options let you handle that. Now, for most of the service applications that are manageable, they have their own user interfaces, and so you can select, for example, the search service application and click Manage, and it takes you to a whole set of pages that are related to specifically managing that search service application. Metadata is really important in SharePoint 2013. And what metadata is information about information. And we use metadata in the process of applying taxonomy. So taxonomy is the practice of classification. And so metadata takes the form of any of the fields that you can put into an item in a list or a library. It's information about that piece of information. So if it's a calendar item, the fact that the meeting has a location, that piece of information that there's a location is information about the meeting. Now, the Manage Metadata service is used to centralize definitions of terms so that our taxonomy is consistent across the entire property that we're using. So instead of using text fields that people enter in as free-form entries, or choices where there's a static list that's been created, or maybe even a lookup list where there's a lot of items and it's difficult to work with drop-downs, would work fine within the context of a single list within a single site. But term sets from the Manage Metadata service can be reused across all of the site collections inside of a farm. And they're very important because the Managed Metadata service powers metadata columns, search refiners, and is also used to handle navigation in both publishing sites and in document libraries. All right, so what we're going to do now is jump over and actually take a look at the Managed Metadata Service application and get you familiar with that, because this is used so much in SharePoint 2013 that if it's not working right or if you don't understand it, you're going to have a hard time getting anything to work. All right, so here we are in Central Admin, and I'm going to manage service applications, and I'm going to select the Managed Metadata Service. And I'll choose Manage on the ribbon. And we get this handy-dandy user interface. Now, the first thing that you're going to want to do after you create this is establish a term store administrator that is able to work in whatever site collection that you happen to be in. In my development environment, I always use the administrator account as the site collection administrator, and so I also make that account the term store administrator. That way, I don't ever have to do any additional setup as I go along. But this could be an individual, a number of individuals, or a SharePoint group, or even an AD group. As you can see, it is possible to have multiple languages. In this environment, I only have the English language pack installed, so the only choice I have is English. Over here on the left-hand panel is the actual set of terms that I've created, or my term store. So there's one for system out of the box, and this is where hashtags, keywords, and orphan items go. All of these have a similar set of properties, which are description. We can give individual term sets owners so that they can be managed by subject matter experts independently of the overall SharePoint farm, along with a contact who can receive feedback and also alerts to let them know that people would like terms added. And then they all have a submission policy. So when a term set is closed, only the managers can add terms, which is what this description right here says. When it's open, users can add terms from a tagging application. And so when we have a closed submission policy, then what we have is a rigid, centrally controlled taxonomy. When we have an open submission policy, this is called colloquially a folksonomy, because all the folks can add terms into the term set. All right, so what we're going to do is up here in Managed Metadata Service, we're going to create a new group of terms, and we'll say these are colors. All right, and within colors, we can create different term sets. So maybe we would have a term set of colors that were used for, I don't know, paint, and maybe another that was used for clothing. So within an individual term set, we can have lots of terms. So inside of, whoops, I'm not sure exactly what happened there. Let me delete this term that I just created and try this again. So under colors, I want a new term set, and this is called clothing. All right, so for paint, we'll create a term and we'll say we've got red and blue and sky green. And we can also reuse terms across term sets. So I could come into clothing and choose reuse terms and come up to colors here and go under paint and say I want to reuse blue. And now the term blue, I know, applies both to clothing colors and to paint colors. And you know, this is a trivial kind of nonsensical example, but you see people use term sets for product groups, for locations, for customers, for time, for all sorts of different things. You can use term sets anywhere you have important classification that you want to share across lots of pieces of information inside of your SharePoint farm. All right, now once I have a term set defined, I need to use it within the context of a managed metadata column. So I've come over to a team site that I created previously, and I'm going to go into the site settings page, and I'm going to go to site columns and just create a new one. And I'll call this paint color and say this is a managed metadata column. I'm not going to use this, so we'll just leave it in custom columns. And I can say whether or not I want to allow multiple values or not. And what I'm going to do is come down here for colors, and under paint, I will select it. So the values that this field will be able to contain are whatever terms happen to be inside of paint. I also have the option at the level of the site collection to edit the term set just for that site collection, depending on whether or not I am a term set administrator. And I can also set a default value. All right, so I'll choose OK. Now, where this is powerful is if I then went to a completely different site collection. In this case, we're going to use a development site that I created previously. I can do exactly the same thing. So once again, I can create a column, and I'm not going to go through the process of creating this, but I will say this is managed metadata. And once again, here is that clothing and paint colors term sets. So no matter where I'm interested in colors in my entire SharePoint farm, I can ensure that the taxonomy and the terms that I use to describe those are always the same. The search service application powers search, and it is based on a product that Microsoft acquired a few years ago called Fast Search. In 2010, Fast Search was a connector. So it was a separate thing that you needed to install and then connect your SharePoint farm in order to use, and it was a product that you had to pay extra money to get. In SharePoint 2013, the Fast technology has all been incorporated into SharePoint, and Fast is no longer a standalone product going forward, at least not with regards to SharePoint. And what the search service application does is two things. First is that it indexes content. It indexes content in a very sophisticated way. So it will go through a process called crawling and read in types of content that it understands and build a sophisticated index of that content. And then it uses that index to fulfill search queries. So end users can enter in keyword queries through the browser, just like you've ever done with Google or Bing. And the search service application is responsible for interpreting those, finding the items in the index, and returning the ones that are most applicable to the search. And you can also tune the query relevance and weight things and do all sorts of things to manually improve the search relevance beyond what SharePoint does out of the box natively, which is really, really sophisticated in and of itself because it's constantly tuning its relevancy based on click-throughs and the success of individual searches. There are a variety of content sources that you can set up for the search service application to crawl. Of course, SharePoint is the first and most common one. And whenever you create a search service application, all SharePoint sites is the one and only content source that is created for you automatically by default. But you can also index other web properties. Anything that can be read through HTTP can be indexed by SharePoint. File shares can be indexed. Microsoft Exchange can be indexed. Business data through business connectivity services can be indexed. And you can also create custom content sources if you need to. Almost everything that is new and interesting in SharePoint 2013 depends on search. So let's take a look at the search service application and some of its important pieces. All right, so in Central Admin, I'm going to go to Manage Service Applications, and this time I'm going to scroll down and find the Search Service application and manage it. Now, the first and most important thing about the search service application is the content that it is going to index. And so here on the content sources page, we can see that I have a content source defined which was created by default called local SharePoint sites. And I have configured my environment for continuous crawling. So one of the first things that I do on this machine is come in, edit this content source, and select that I want to do continuous crawls. Now there are also incremental crawls which can run based on a schedule, and full crawls that can run based on a schedule. There are certain operations that you can do that do require a full crawl even when you have continuous crawling turned on. Mostly with regards to configuring managed properties, which we'll talk about in a little while. So if I need to do a full crawl, that is available to me under the context menu. Now while we're looking at this thing, we can see information about what has happened during the crawls, how long the crawls have taken to run, how many successes we had, how many warnings we had, how many errors, and how many items have been deleted. So you can see in this particular site, I've been creating and deleting a lot of content. I can see that by content source, by host name, different breakdowns of errors. This environment only has a few things on it, and so most of these are not too terribly interesting. But that's where you would look at it. Now, one of the key things about making search really sing inside of an organization is not to just set it up and walk away from it, but it is to take a look at what people are actually doing and respond to that. Do a little bit of tuning, understand what they're doing, and try to make their experience a little bit better. And to that end, there are all sorts of analytic reports that are available to us inside of search. And these are available underneath the usage reports page. And these are all exported out as Excel spreadsheets that we can look at. So we can see the top queries that people are running and the abandoned queries that people are running. And abandoned queries are something we really need to look at because it means somebody's looking for information and they just gave up because it was impossible for them to find. So if we were to open up one of these, you can see that we just get a ton of data. Now, this is, again, a development machine, and so there's not a lot of queries going on, and I'm typically searching for the same things over and over again to build demos, but you get the idea. All right, so going back to the search service application, we can see that in addition to the usage reports, there are also some health reports that are available to us. So with this, we can use it to see, how well the crawl is running, what the crawl rate looks like, and we need to look at these things from time to time in order to determine, do we need to add more or maybe even remove some processing power for the search service application. So that's the crawl, and then of course we have a corresponding report that goes along with the query that will tell us, how long the queries took to run and how relevant the results were. All right, so that is the search service application. Now, if you have your search service application running and healthy, then you could just stop there. At that point, it's possible for people to do searches from their sites. But there are a couple of site templates that you can use to improve the experience, and these are search centers, which are simply put sites for search. And there are two search centers available to you out of the box. The first one is called Basic Search Center, and it consists of one search page and one results page. You can edit both of those, but it's pretty basic. And this is what you would use in a small property. There's also an Enterprise Search Center, and this is also known as Search Center with tabs. And this will let you create a tabbed experience with multiple kinds of search pages and multiple kinds of results pages. The Search Center with tabs uses the publishing infrastructure, so it's a publishing site. And the main implication of that is that the design manager is included on this site. So if you want to create a heavily branded search experience for maybe a public-facing website, then the Enterprise Search Center is the one you should select. All right, so let's take a look at both of these search centers and how they work. All right, so here we are in Central Admin once again, and I'm going to go to the Create Site Collections page, and we're going to create a new basic search center. So we'll call this one Basic Search, and I'll call this Basic. And under the Enterprise tab are both of the search centers that we can pick from. So there's Basic Search Center. I will make my admin account the Site Collection Administrator as always, and I will choose OK. All right, so let's open this up and see what we've got. All right, so looks pretty basic, right? So I could do a search for SharePoint, and I can see I get a lot of different result types back from a lot of different authors, modified at a lot of different times. And the flyouts all work, and life is good. Now this has the capability to search multiple sites as the search center. So back here in Central Admin, if we went to the search service application and went to manage, we can see one of the things it wants us to tell it is the location of the global search center. All right, so if I wanted to use this basic search site as that location, I would just copy this URL over here. And then click OK. Now one thing about this is I need to recycle IIS in order for this to be picked up by the sites that I already have, which is unfortunate, but there you go. So we're going to do an IIS reset, and now we'll wait till that finishes. All right, so let's go into one of our sites where there is no content, and I'll do a search for content. And it doesn't come back with anything, but now we have the option to expand our search to include everything, and when we expand the search, it takes us to the Basic Search Center. All right, so in the Basic Search Center, you do have the option to edit both the home page and the results page. But you can't add additional pages, and there's no real support for a heavy-duty design. For that, we need the enterprise search. All right, so come back over here to Central Admin, and I'm going to go to Create Site Collection. And this time we will create an enterprise search center. All right, so as always, I wish there was a button here that would let me say use the current user. That would be a nice feature that Microsoft could add for us. And we'll click OK and let that site get created. All right, so our site was created. And if we go to it, we can see that initially it looks really similar to the Basic Search Center. The key difference here is that we have access to Design Manager, so we can really mess around with the look and feel. And we also have the ability to add a page. Now, I'm not going to go through the process of setting the tabs up because there are a couple of lists in the background that drive this. But if you were going to implement people search and maybe some website that you had crawling, or lots of different content sources where you wanted to give a more granular experience inside of your search center, or if you were going to do heavy branding, this is the site that you would create as opposed to the Basic Search Center. Now, one last thing that I want to look at before we move on is I'm going to go back into this dev site. And a second ago we did that search and we got the out-of-the-box OSS search results page with a link to say expand your search to search everything. Well, say we've set the global search URL, but we have a need to do some sort of one-off configuration. Every site collection has its own set of overridable search settings. So under Site Collection Administration, we can see the search settings page here, and the Search Center URL isn't filled in because it's global. But we have the option to send the queries to a particular location instead of having it go through the out-of-the-box. So we have the option to configure all of that on a kind of one-off basis if we want. I'm not going to do that, but be aware that you have global, but you also have granular overrides available. So just to review, metadata columns are specialized lookup columns that we can use to control our taxonomy. And what I'm about to show you will work in SharePoint 2013 with really any kind of column, but is most usually implemented with metadata columns. One reason for that is because in SharePoint 2010, what I'm going to show you required metadata columns. But metadata columns are key to search refinements, and they're also used for cross-site publishing and metadata navigation. What you need to do is go into the Search Service app after the content has been crawled and find the property which was added to the search index automatically when it was crawled. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second. Once you've done that, you set the settings to say that that column is available for refinements, and then you need to actually manually execute a full crawl, assuming that you want to be able to pick it up right then. And then finally, and this is the biggest difference between SharePoint 2013 and SharePoint 2010, is that in SharePoint 2010, the refinement panels were more or less filled automatically based on the content that was coming back as a result of your search. In SharePoint 2013, they leave it up to you as the site creator to specify which columns are going to be used for refinements in a given search results page. All right, so what we're going to do now is jump back over to the SharePoint machine. And to avoid the need to do a full crawl, I have already created a document library that's using a metadata column. It's got some documents in it. And I'll take you through the steps necessary to show those as refinements in a search center. All right, so here we have a document library called Books, and it contains a number of book chapters with different subjects controlled by metadata columns. Now, before we look at search, I want to show you a type of metadata navigation that's been available since SharePoint 2010 that I think is very useful in a lot of situations. A lot of my clients use this functionality. And that is metadata navigation at the level of a library. Now, to use this, I need to go into Site Settings and Manage Site Features and find the metadata navigation and filtering feature and turn it on. Once I've done that, in my document libraries, assuming they have metadata columns, I can go into the library settings and there will be a new link there called Metadata Navigation Settings. And so I can select that and say that I would like to drive navigation for this based on the book subject. All right, and then I just choose OK. And now, when I go back to Books, underneath the Quick Launch, I get a little tree view of the various refinements that are available to me. And I can just click on these to navigate through the library. All right, but what we're really talking about here is using these metadata columns to do refinements off of search. So I'm going to come over here to the Search Service application. And under Search Schema, and this is another one of those things that is overridable at the site collection level, I'm going to open this up and I'm going to do a search for the word book because that's what the name of my taxonomy field is. Now I've already configured this column and run a full crawl so that the final piece of this, which is the search site, will work correctly. But if I edit this, what I needed to do was say that this is going to be available for refinements and that I'm going to allow it to do sorting. And there are some other settings here like whether or not anonymous users are able to see it. All right, so this is all set up. And you can see there's lots of other things that we can do in our search schema beyond that. And I've run a full crawl, so it's all included in the index. So I have another search center over here that I created previously. And so I'm going to execute a search that I know is going to give me back all of those book chapters because it was a web content management book. And I can see that I have in my refinement panel a refiner for book subject. So I can see the ones related to branding and the ones related to design and the ones related to administration. Now in SharePoint 2010, the refinement panels in SharePoint Enterprise Search were more or less driven by heuristics. There wasn't a whole lot that you could do in the way of controlling which refiners displayed in most cases. Conversely, in SharePoint 2013, it is up to you as the Search Center designer to include the refiners that you want. So the way that's done is by editing the refinement web part. So under here in the web part editor, we have a button that says choose refiners. And what I've done is I have said I want to add the OWS tax ID book subject into the possible refiners that I may have. Now, if the search term that's entered has nothing to do with any of the documents that are tagged with book subject, then it's not going to display an empty refiner. So the selected refiners are the set of possible refiners that might display when somebody does a search. And I can control what order those are in. And if I don't like something, I can take it out. So I could get rid of, last modified time if I wanted to, which I don't. Within an individual refiner, I can give it a display name, which I'm always going to want to do. And I can specify a refinement item. This is a display template, which is a JavaScript or HTML-based display template, depending on whether or not I'm using publishing. I can control the sort order. So right now I have it sorting by count, and you can see it's BDA, but I could also sort it by name instead. And I can control the sort direction. There's a preview button here. And when you preview it, I've noticed this is a bug. You get the GUIDs that represent the IDs of the metadata columns as part of the lookup, but this is just a ghost in the machine with regards to the preview. All right, so that's how you do refinements. And one last thing I'll show is if I did some sort of search where there were no things that match the refiners, right? It doesn't have any refiners to show me. So it has to actually apply to the content that came back.